content area literacy, we tend to think about the textbooks that kids use in their content area classes, things like the social studies textbook, science textbook, or materials that come with those programs and so on. And that's not inappropriate, but what we've found in talking to middle school students who are struggling with reading is that by the time they finish with elementary school, the only things they think count as reading are novels and textbooks. They only think it counts as reading if it's a thick book with chapters or textbook assignments or something like that. And there's a whole world of reading out there. Back in the early 2000s, NWEA, the MAPS test company, asked me and my teaching partner at Gunnison Middle School to do some consulting for them because they wanted to figure out, okay, if people get a certain score on a test and they missed this item and this item and this item, how can we tell which skills they need to learn? And so they had us working on that for a few weeks with our kids to isolate some of the skills. And the problem with that was that when those test scores came back and people had missed certain items, the list of skills that they wanted us to try to teach kids over a school year was sometimes like 350 or 400 skills that they wanted us to teach based on the test items that they had missed. And so, we just went back to them and said, we can't do that. You can't plan a school year around individualizing 300 to 400 lessons for each kid based on the skills they missed by missing test items. Not to mention the fact that we don't know why they missed those test items. But what we did is, as we were looking through the materials that they had brought to us, we were actually able to see a lot of the items on the NWEA MAPS test. And what we noticed was that that test actually used a lot of different kinds of authentic text. And so we went back to them and said, well, we may not be able to teach hundreds of skills every year because we only have, 33 weeks of school, 5 days a week, some holidays mixed in there. There's only so many hours in a school day. You can't teach hundreds of individualized skill-based lessons for kids just based on what their test scores are. But those authentic texts that were actually in the test came back as something where we thought, yeah, we can teach kids how to read an ingredients label. We can teach kids how to read a birth certificate. We can teach kids how to read the installation manual for a ceiling fan. We can teach kids how to work with song lyrics or the different kinds of games that there are out there, the literacy that goes into those different kinds of games. If we think about our content learning and what kinds of texts might support us in our content learning, it's much easier to select from a series of headings and subheadings of the authentic texts that are out there in the world. So we sat down and we just took the authentic texts that were actually in the NWEA MAPS test and started making a list of all of the kinds of things that you could teach kids to read. And this list of what counts as reading different kinds of print, this ballooned for us into about 85, 86 items really quickly, but what we found at the very beginning was that just by going back to the test, we were able to find 35 different kinds of authentic texts. So think about this. If you want your kids to be doing well with your content literacy, which are the kinds of texts that are going to support most what you're learning in your unit, for those kids to think, yeah, we're reading the real stuff that's out there in the world. It's not textbook learning, it's not reading novels, it's not all the standard stuff. What are you going to bring in, add to your classroom library, and use during your content teaching units? So I'm just going to bring up some of these kinds of things. So I've got a whole folder full of death certificates. So this was done for a content area unit where we wanted to show people all sorts of different approaches to reading primary source documents. And so I'm just going to open up this one. This was a death certificate that we found when we were doing an examination of the flu epidemic of 1918. We were just sifting through looking for evidence of that epidemic. And we ran across this one. St. Louis, Charles G. Aufrichtig, male, white, married, born on November 1st, 1884. But it's the thing that you jump right to here is number 17. Number 17, death was cyanide potassium poison contributory suicide, really kind of a violent and difficult death. And we wanted to know, how do I help kids learn to read a death certificate? We had to go through a whole series of lessons on helping them figure out, okay, I need to look at the numbering series. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It is numbered in series, and each of those sections has a specific kind of information in it that you need to read. So death certificates is definitely one type of reading that's out there, and that does have an awful lot to do sometimes with content literacy. So in one of the units that we teach, we have all of these different death certificates that you can find. We found death certificates from my own relatives, death certificates from the influenza period that we were talking about. A death register from 1841. When you go back long enough, there's not an actual certificate for each person. In fact, we found that for Abraham Lincoln, when he died, there was no death certificate. But just about 7 or 8 years ago, they found this document in the National Archives, just hidden in a file folder somewhere. They'd never seen it before, and famous people also. So Abraham Lincoln, Robert Johnson, a famous blues player, Sid Vicious, the lead singer for the Sex Pistols, Frank Sinatra. We found death certificates for Marilyn Monroe, for John Lennon, all sorts of people that you can find the death certificates for. And the outcome for that was that we were having people do, I'm going to bring this one up. As an authentic outcome, we were having people put together death certificates for a fictional character, someone they wanted to see a death certificate for. So this one was a Tolkien-based death certificate. And kids made death certificates based on whatever they were reading in their free reading at that time, or things that they had read in the past. So let's look at some other authentic text. Let's see if it's still in the same folder. Yeah. So seed packets. This is an interesting thing to think about. Whoops, that's not what I was trying to find. Although maps is another interesting thing that we want to bring in for kids. So let's see. There we go. So seed packets have a bunch of different spaces on them, much like a death certificate. You read here, you read here, you read down here. These pieces are not numbered. They're just little patches of text all over this seed packet, and you have to know how to read those pieces. So let's see, there's another one up here, an address, a description, and a title, and then you've got this nice little blurb here about the seeds that you're going to plant. You've got a blurb about the company. You've got this whole thing over here about organic, and then you've got this big chart over here that tells you when and how to plant those things. So a seed packet, how do you read a seed packet? It's not like chapter reading, but it's definitely something one has to be able to read and spend time figuring out how do you navigate this. And there's plenty of text here in complete sentences and partial sentences, titles that are 1 and 2 words, and paragraphs that really don't seem to go beyond like 2 or 3 sentences. So I've got a whole folder here just filled with seed packets that I've downloaded. I've got restaurant menus. I've got recipes. I've got all sorts of different things that are going to go into this folder, and I'm just going to come back to the authentic text. Whoops, that's not where I'm trying to go. Where's my authentic text? There we go. What counts as reading? So think about this as you dig into your content literacy unit, as you're designing it, that you want to think about what kind of variety that you can use to support the kids in reading. Books are great. You're going to find all sorts of different kinds of informational books, probably some fiction connections, but you also want to think about all of the different other kinds of print that are out there. Could you find different types of tables, schedules, and calendars? Are there different kinds of reference books that you might use? What kinds of advertisements, what kinds of signs are out there, what kinds of receipts, checks, bills, charge card slips, shipping and handling charts, all the things that you use when you buy stuff. Those might be interesting for math. Uh, Food packaging is certainly interesting for working with math. So the labels that are on there, products, ingredients, nutritional information, all of those things might be useful for you. So for this part of what you're doing, I just want you to think about kind of blowing open the idea of what counts as reading and starting to assemble and gather together all sorts of different types of text beyond what people expect, the books, the textbooks, and so on. All right.